Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Wilderness Channel. Today we're talking about tracking techniques and equipment used in learning about tracking. These are lion tracks. They've been imprinted in mud, obviously quite old because the mud's dried, and they're being compared to my hand for comparison. There are various techniques you use with measuring tracks and various tools. One of them is the tracking stick, which is used to point out tracks, to circle tracks, and to measure the dimensions of tracks. You also use pegs to mark the location of individual prints along a trail, and then of course various guidebooks. Another way of recording tracks is to use plaster of Paris, which you mix in a container or a plastic bag with water and then pour into the track, making sure that it's the right consistency so that it's not too runny, but you also want to cast the track without disturbing it. Here you have one of my students who's actually casting a leopard track at a water hole, and some more students here also at the same water hole casting other tracks. It's a great student exercise or environmental education exercise to do that. Here are two more tracks being cast. We use forms, which are just basically plastic strips that have been taped together to hold the track in place, the cast in place. Here are some of the examples of tracks that have been recorded in this way. They're negative impressions of the tracks. It's good to photograph tracks and keep as much of a record as possible in terms of cataloging track and sign that you find in your area. It helps speed up the learning process. Here I'm just photographing a Cape centipede eater that had been killed, probably driven over, but it could be many different things. Cell phones are ideal for photographing tracks, but regular SLR cameras are also great. They may be a bit bulky, unfortunately, though. It's good to also have scale. When you're photographing this, you need to have a small rule, a Leatherman knife, a lighter, a matchbox for scale, and some people will place the cameras on a tripod, which gives you a much better quality picture. There won't be any movement, and you can also standardize the distance at which the track is taken for comparisons by scale of the pictures. You also need to be able to measure tracks, so you need to look at the scale of the track, but you also need to be able to measure the tracks. You can use vernier calipers, meter rules, not meter rules, 15 centimeter rules. You can use a tape measure and also a compass for finding direction, so you know which direction the tracks are going. Measuring tracks involves measuring the length, width, stride, and straddle of the tracks, but you also want to look at the individual tracks and measure them according to what kind of tracks they are. So the measurements dimensions change, and you can see them listed here, starting with tracks with paws, and obviously the larger tracks you're going to measure without the claws, the smaller tracks such as mongoose with the claws. And then of course measuring the edge of the width of the tracks, you're going to measure from the edge of the track usually. Here we have an example of a lion track, and we're showing the way you measure from the toe tips basically to the back of the pad. There are also measurements you can do with in terms of the width of the pad. So you want to look at basically the far outer edge of the pad. Essentially where the edge of the toes is in this track is where you want to measure the width of the track from. When you're working with other animals, you're going to measure in a different way. These are paw prints. In this example here, you have hoof prints, cloven-hoofed animal. So your approach is going to be different. You're going to measure the length from the total length of the hoof here, which kind of stands to reason. And then when you're measuring the width of the hoof, you want to go to the outer edge of the hoof. So these are just illustrations of how you would measure the different kinds of tracks in your tracking area. Obviously, there will be differences in the dimensions of the tracks measured depending on the depth of the soil and whether it's mud or not. Here's a rhino track showing you how to measure the length of the rhino track. You measure it basically from the back of the pad to the front toe, which is actually technically a hoof. And then if you want to measure the outside width of the track, you want to look at measuring from the outside of edge of the two toes that make up the outside toes of the hoof, outside hooves, hoof toes. With elephant, you just measure the outside of the pad. Then if you're looking at stride and straddle length, stride is the distance from one track to another of the same foot. In this case, we're looking at ostrich, so it's going to be a little bit different. You're going to just use the stride of from one, or the distance from one foot to the next. With the straddle, you're measuring the width of the animal's track sequence. Okay, so once again with these ostrich tracks, it's from the outer edge of the track on the one side to the outer edge of the track on the other side. Finally, you know, when you're measuring tracks, you want to be able to measure the tracks using a piece of perspex, for example. You want to trace the tracks. So perspex is the best option. Here you can see a picture here of a track and a piece of perspex that's been placed over it, which I will then be able to trace in order to get an impression of the track as it stands in terms of dimensions. In the field, you do the same thing over the track. You trace the outer edge of the track, as you can see in this example, so that you can get as accurate a track as possible. Beware of the area of parallax, so always look from directly above. Try not to have anything shift. For example, perspex must be kept in one place. Once you've traced those tracks, you'll basically be left with an impression that you can put onto a piece of paper for contrast, white paper, and then photocopy as needed. Okay, it can be either photocopied or it can be hand traced, so that you have a permanent record of the track. Then once you have the track, you can actually start to measure the dimensions of the track. Typically, for measuring the dimensions, you can measure them on site, which would be ideal, or you can measure the trace track, which I'm showing illustrated here with the vernier calipers. Vernier calipers are very, very accurate and precise instruments for measuring tracks, so you can get a really, really accurate measurement from that. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you like the content, please subscribe, and I'll try to produce more contents similar to the content that you've seen here. Thank you, and see you at the next video.